Hey guys, Kaaboose here. Quick thing before we get started here. The footage on today's video is not me. This is footage from Strife's Guild Wars 2 channel. The reason I'm using this footage is because it is far more relevant than any footage I have to the current argument. If you want to have a look at his channel, click the little picture down the bottom there. I'm also adding a picture to Plasma 3's music channel here as well, because people continuously ask me, where is this background music coming from? I put it in the About section of every video and nobody seems to notice it. So I'm thinking of leaving a little icon for his channel there, because you really should support him. He does good work. Let me know in the comment section if you don't like this, if you do like it, etc. Alright, on to what we should be talking about. In our last video, I went over the importance of risk versus reward in an MMO, and the current state of risk versus reward in Guild Wars 2, as well as covering the possible solution of introducing elite dungeons like the Underworld from Guild Wars 1. So why don't we have an endgame dungeon like the Underworld in Guild Wars 2? Some figure that ArenaNet doesn't see the point in making content that only the hardcore would be interested in playing, as it won't hold the interest of the majority of their player base, and therefore would not be worth the resources. I don't believe this to be the case at all, as ArenaNet knows there are plenty of players wishing for an endgame challenge to Guild Wars 2. Also, if they did what they did in Guild Wars 1, and made the majority of the items from the endgame dungeon sellable, that problem would be solved. A casual that really wanted an item from an endgame dungeon, but felt it would be too hard to learn, would instead farm up the gold required to purchase it, which would require them to invest more time into Guild Wars 2. Even better, from NCSoft's point of view anyway, they might simply buy gems with real-world currency and then transfer them into gold. The reason I believe ArenaNet haven't made this content is simply because they do not know how. All one has to do is look at the current state of the PvE metagame to understand why. Look at this. This here is one of the hardest bosses in Guild Wars 2, and this guild group here is going to kill it in 40 seconds. To make it worse, all of the mechanics of this boss are completely circumvented by the damage caused by the players. Kudos to the guild though. It still requires good timing, coordination and preparation to do this, but this really should not be possible. So why has the metagame come to this when the idea behind dungeons in Guild Wars 2 was to have everyone doing a little bit of everything? It all comes down to the Guild Wars 2 Trinity. No, I do not mean the Holy Trinity from previous MMOs. I mean the Holy Trinity that was promised to us during development. Instead of going with the tried and true tank DPS healer Trinity, ArenaNet promised us a damage support control Trinity. Characters were supposed to be encouraged to do a bit of all three: damage the mobs, support their allies, and also control the mobs. So, why isn't this the case? Well, because as it currently stands, damage is the be-all and end-all of the current metagame. The faster something dies, the less damage it will cause, and in turn, making a good offense the best defense in Guild Wars 2. So why doesn't ArenaNet design their encounters so players use control as well? Because ArenaNet cut corners in development, and they are still doing it today. Allow me to explain. There was one dungeon available in beta. Just one, late in the beta period, and it was a pretty messy affair. A lot of work needed to be done to balance the usefulness of damage, support, and control. This was made doubly hard by the fact that if the developers altered player skills, it would affect other aspects of the game as well, such as PvP and structured PvP. However, as is evident with the lack of polish Guild Wars 2 had outside the starting zones on release, ArenaNet did not have the resources to commit to this, so they took a drastic and very damaging shortcut. Instead of working on monster AI and making them use abilities and act similarly to the players, they were given basic AI and attacks. The same was done with the bosses. However, ArenaNet knew that because of their simplistic AI, the bosses would fall prey to the control abilities players had at their disposal, so they invented the Unshakable and Defiance effects. This is the absolute stupidest thing ArenaNet has ever done. Unshakable reduces the effect of all control abilities, and if a mob is disabled, it gains stacks of Defiant, which render disabling attacks useless unless enough of these attacks have been performed to remove the Defiant buff. Couple this with the fact that most control abilities have lengthy cooldowns, they are borderline useless when fighting a boss in Guild Wars 2. So now that control is useless, only support and damage are going to be of any use in boss encounters. Support still sees use, though usually only to increase the damage output of the party, and damage reigns supreme because the faster a boss goes down, the less damage it will inflict on the group. Defense should primarily be the combination of support and control, not damage and support. If Guild Wars 2 wants to get back to its original goal of structured and involved combat, it has to encourage the use of control and support. It's not going to be an easy job, as mob AI and abilities will need to be adjusted accordingly, but the real problem is the unshakable and defiant buffs. Don't get me wrong, I know why they exist, to stop control from being too powerful, but they are destroying ArenaNet's vision of an involved and varied combat system. Here is my solution to this problem. Do not have the unshakable buff reduce the duration of control skills, or, if you must, don't make it so strong that control skills are useless. Give bosses with the unshakable buff a movement speed increase. Not so much that they can catch a player using swiftness, but enough to stop kiting without some form of control or support being implemented. Have bosses with the unshakable effect be able to hit through blind and Aegis, but have the damage of that attack reduced by 90%. This way you don't have to worry about players using these skills to avoid mechanics, as everyone has dodge for that, but they are still useful for survival. Lastly, give your bosses plenty of weak but regular attacks mixed in with the powerful ones on a longer cooldown. If you do this, you will no longer have to resort to giving bosses one-hit attacks to make them threatening. If no control is used, a boss will close the distance quickly and inflict damage fast as well. If its target has low toughness vitality, it's gonna be creamed in no time. Of course, if the boss's target does have a good defensive stats in its build, it should be able to last longer, but it should not be able to last indefinitely without the use of support and control abilities. If the boss was weakened, the residual damage would be more manageable, as it also would be if blinds, Aegis, protection and other support effects were in use. If this was used as the base to work from when designing an encounter, it would encourage, or if done correctly, necessitate the combination of damage, control and support in an encounter. Now, on to Defiant. It does need to exist. The best designed boss in the game would be for naught if it could be stun-locked into submission. However, a simple design change is all that needs to be implemented. Have Defiant stacks reduce naturally as well as being able to be stripped. For example, stunning a boss may give it 5 stacks of Defiant. Have one of these stacks fall off every 2 seconds. The boss can no longer be stun-locked, but disabling skills will still have their place. If there's a mechanic you really want to be unstoppable, have the boss gain the sturdy effect just before it uses it and then lose it afterwards. Now you are also encouraging players to make use of their previously worthless disabling skills without making them overpowered. Also, allow the blowout effect to stun bosses too big to be affected by it, so it's still useful as an interrupt or a disable. With these changes implemented, you now have the building blocks to make some much more interesting, involved encounters, and more importantly, balanced encounters, both in the open world as well as in the dungeons. They won't be as easy to design and implement, but nothing worth doing is ever easy. Once you start factoring in boons, conditions, and other special effects, and reaction, the possibilities are endless. And that's even before taking into consideration the bundle system. Another thing I really have to stress to ArenaNet when designing fights is to encourage players to vary their setups to overcome some encounters. There's nothing wrong with forcing the party to bring specific abilities, whether they be from weapons or otherwise, to overcome an encounter efficiently. Just make sure you remove the cooldown from changing skills when out of combat, or allow us to change them while they are still cooling down and bring over the remaining cooldown to the new skill. Otherwise, changing them causes more hassle than they're worth. This may seem like a lot of work for a slightly different system, but I cannot stress how much more self-worth players would feel in a group knowing their choice of skills might have meant the difference between success and failure. For example, a fight that came so close to the wire, if it hadn't been for your support, the group would have failed. A stun that stopped an attack that would have finished off the group. A blowout effect that moved the mob into a necessary position. Players love to feel their actions have made a difference in an interactive environment, and as it stands in the current Zerka metagame, or with the open world bosses, all the player amounts to is a small part of a basic hive mind. I could go into more detail, but if I did this video could stretch on for hours, so I'm going to wind it up here. Remember when leaving your thoughts in the comments section, Reddit, or on the forums that these changes are suggested to improve the building blocks ArenaNet have to work with when creating an encounter. They are not going to magically solve all the potential problems that arise from creating an encounter. They will, however, help us to get away from the current damage is greater than everything metagame that Guild Wars 2 PvE combat has become, and bring us back to Guild Wars 2's vision of a new Trinity. Personally, I never even attempted this, as the stories I heard of how brutal this place was were very off-putting. Sure, you could farm up an item that was literally worth more gold than you could carry, but when this is the impression you get from players that have attended it, you tend to think twice.
We'll talk about it when you want to talk about it. I don't blame you. I don't blame you.
How did you make it so your legs work?
One is the lava. In the fire.
Stand in the fire to make your legs work. Oh my god, he weren't trolling.